Welcome to Schweitzer Drive, a podcast where we explore what goes on between the generation of electricity and the light switch. Join Dave Whitehead as he interviews the entrepreneurs, innovators, and experts who are inventing the future of electric power.
Hello, I'm Dave Whitehead, CEO at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, and today I am pleased to welcome Dr. Noel Schulz to the podcast. Noel is the Edmund O. Schweitzer III Chair in Power Apparatus and Systems in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Washington State University. She is the Chief Scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory since February of 2020. She's been active for over 26 years in teaching, research, and service at 6 U.S. universities. Today, we're going to be talking about women in STEM. Welcome, Noel. Thank you for coming to the show.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
This is going to be a lot of fun. So I would make the assertion, I think we all believe a diverse workforce is a good thing. Diversity provides different perspectives when we're trying to solve really our nation's hardest challenges, or for that matter, any kind of challenge or problem we have. But having been in the electric engineering profession for almost 30 years, it still seems that STEM careers are still mainly filled by males. So I thought it'd be fun to ask you, Noel, how do we go about attracting females or even other underrepresented groups to STEM careers, bringing diversity into this workforce where, if I have 10% of the women and yet in the electrical engineering workforce, I think you're going to share better statistics with us about this. 10% of our population works in our industry, and yet they represent half of our population. There's just, I got to believe, a huge gap. So let's get into this. While I feel engineering is a male-dominant vocation, just from my observation, do you have some statistics or percentages of women or underrepresented groups in our STEM profession?
Yeah, Dave. So this is a really good question to figure out how do we get more women and underrepresented students as well as engineers into careers in STEM fields. And if you look nationally, we've seen some progress in the number of women and multicultural students that are involved, but it really hasn't been at the level we would like to see it. If we look back to 2003, we had about 10% of the STEM, science and engineering, women were women, about 10%. And now if we look across, we're probably about 28 to 30% overall engineering. But as we look at some disciplines, particularly electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, a lot of time those numbers are still closer to 10%. So we still struggle in some areas to have women thinking about STEM careers.
Why electrical engineering and mechanical engineering? So I heard that went up from 10 to 20%. Yay. But I go look at, the industry certainly that we're so heavily involved in or we chose as our vocation. Why is it's still at that 10% level, do you think?
Well, I think a couple reasons. One is today's student wants to make an impact in the world. And a lot of surveys found students that may have graduated in the 1980s that salary was an important part, career opportunities were an important part. And as we look at students today, both men and women, trying to make a difference in the world is a part. And we don't always do a good job as engineers of making sure people know the impact of certain engineers. I joke that power engineers don't really like to be on the news because it normally means there's a bad thing. And so we don't talk about all the positives. And so what we need to do that more for middle school, high school students about the impacts. If we talk about civil engineering and clean water, we talk about electrical engineering and power. We talk about, our cell phones and computer science, all the different opportunities that are available out there, not just video games. People will see that there are ways to make a difference in the world. And the students don't always know about those. And I think that comes to some of the challenges that are out there.
So you mentioned talking about STEM, maybe the generating interest both in any gender and any represented or underrepresented part of our population. Is it You said high school, maybe junior high. Do you even have to go down to elementary? I'm always curious about it. I think if you woke up, your senior year in high school, you wanted to be an engineer, you're probably at a disadvantage if you didn't take calculus in high school or physics. And then I don't know if there's ever any recovery, or it's just easier to go into something else at that point when you go into to college. So any thoughts on how do you go about doing that?
So there are a couple key things that I think are important. One of the things that's important as we look at first generation college students who don't necessarily have a family member who's gone through college and may not know to take calculus to be better prepared for a STEM field, or maybe in a rural area that doesn't offer some of the advanced classes. And so if we look at WSU, for example, about a third of our students are first generation college students. So they don't have a family member they can ask some of those questions. So it's really important for us to get to middle school and high school for the students to know, hey, you need to be taking algebra in 8th or 9th grade so that you can have some of those advanced classes moving on, because some of those early decisions do make an impact in what they can get later in their career and their preparation. The other thing that I think is really important is to give students a chance to see different types of engineering. And Schweitzer Engineering Lab manufacturing is a great example. Mm-hmm. And when I was in 3rd grade, I had a chance to do a manufacturing tour, and I think that helped me get interested in engineering. And I think it's important for us to expose students in middle school and high school to different options. And we can do that virtually now. We've learned a lot in the last year, as well as physically, to take students to different engineering challenges and see where they want to be involved.
That's interesting because probably the younger you are or exposed to STEM, the more likely you would be to choose that as a vocation. You made a point, though, that perhaps your parents didn't go to college or weren't in the STEM field, so maybe they said, when you're in high school, you don't need to worry about taking calculus, or certainly didn't encourage you to take the calculus and chemistry and physics and what have you. But let's assume that does happen. You made a comment about, probably when I was going to school, it was about, my career and probably some money. And maybe I wasn't as thoughtful as kids today about really making an impact on my community or the world or my country. So let's assume if I go to school now, are there ways to catch up? I know that kids don't rush through school in 4 years, kind of like I did, rather, maybe 5 years, 6 years. So based on that more casual way of going through it, are there systems set up, say WSU in particular, since you're there, to help kids that maybe walked onto campus and said, oh, I do want to be an engineer. Unfortunately, I didn't take calculus or all this other stuff to get them through the engineering programs?
Yeah, Dave, I think we're a much friendlier environment than when you and I went through. I remember at Virginia Tech as an undergrad, the first day the department head said, look to your right, look to your left, only one of you is going to graduate. And I was determined that was going to be me. And it was a weed out. We talked about weed out classes and some of that we may have heard. And I think we're much friendlier now to understanding that people come from different backgrounds, and we have different bridge programs. We have a tutoring center that's working with our students. So there are lots of more programs to help people be successful that might not have had the right background but have the interest.
Okay.
And so we do work a lot in those areas to have those programs for those students, particularly across the state of Washington, where we have students coming from rural areas that may not have the same opportunities that folks in urban areas, or even in some areas that don't have a lot of advanced AP classes and other things like that.
Yeah, you guys probably don't have weed out classes anymore, right? There's
Well, we try not to have weed out classes. We try to have opportunities for students to learn and make sure we're also putting them in the right class, and by judging their background and making sure that we're not jumping ahead too fast for them to get settled into college, as well as understand the technical side of math and science.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, we all still have to pass our dynamics and statics classes, right? So the bridges don't fall down at the end of the day, no matter if it took us 4 years to get through school or 6 years to get through school.
Yeah, and exactly. It's not about changing standards, but it's about understanding the differences that people come with different backgrounds. And also, as we look at today's students, they want to know why and not what. And it's really important for us to start with applications and end with equations instead of the other way around. Mm-hmm. because I remember my classes, we would start with the equations. If we were lucky, we got to the applications at the end. But now the students want to say, why do I need to know this, Dr. Schulz? And so we need to talk about some of those applications so they feel motivated that, hey, I do need to know this. And this is where opportunities like internships at companies like SEL really help the students see some of the why. And so they're more willing to buckle down in those classes and understand the what and the equations and do some of those things.
So we talked about a lot of challenges being prepared to go into it, and that could apply to both male and female. But focusing on women in particular, what do you think holds them back or prevents them from becoming engineers?
Well, there are a couple things. First of all, a lot of women will self-select out of engineering and STEM fields because they don't feel that they can have a career and have a family. And one of the things that's important is for us to show role models of people that have careers and have families, and for people to understand their opportunities to do both. And that's more an issue particularly for women related to being able to have a career advancement and be able to have children, have the family that's part of what kind of our culture is at times and things like that. So we see students self-select out of that at times.
Do STEM careers in particular suffer from that, I want to have a family and a career versus other majors or other
well,
vocations?
I think, there were some challenges a while back in computer science because girls thought they had to stay up all night if they were writing code, or they had to do video games, and that wasn't something they wanted to do. So I think it kind of ebbs and flows depending as our different opportunities are there. I think some of it goes into having role models, that if you only see male role models in a field, then you think, well, maybe I can't do that. And I was fortunate as a sophomore, I had a woman faculty member who had 2 kids, and I said, well, she can do it, I can do it too. So I didn't see it as a barrier. But if we don't see role models or people that look like us, then we kind of wonder if it's a field area for us.
That's true. So I'm biased towards electrical engineering, and I see how few women are in my field. Is the ratio true for all STEM vocations? I mean, we were talking a little bit more. It seems like it was getting a little bit better, maybe broadly in STEM. But certainly you pointed out electrical engineering and perhaps mechanical engineering, it's still suffering. Is there a reason those two over, say, civil engineering or computer science?
Well, if we look at like chemical engineering and chemistry, right, there's a lot of similarities in those two. And there are actually higher numbers of women in chemistry. The move from chemistry to chemical engineering doesn't seem quite as a big a shift. But as you look at physics, there are not a lot of women in physics. And there are not a lot of women professors in physics. There are not a lot of graduates in physics. The numbers are really small for women. And so that barrier between what I would say physics and the applied physics, which is both electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, we don't have some of that crossover as much as we've had before. Some of the areas we see, industrial engineering, environmental engineering, chemical engineering, those fields tend to have more women. And I think some of those, there may be some more applications that people see that, I can change the world and do something. Clean water, clean air, chemical engineering, different type of chemicals you can do. And so I think that's where we see more women in. And part of it is we need to continue to tell our story about how we're making an impact. As we talk about, if we talk about renewables, we talk about wind and solar, that seems to be a hook that some of our students will be interested in, that we need to talk about how that applies to the power grid and some of those kind of things.
It's interesting you said there are more women in chemical engineering than electrical engineering, because I'll argue chemical engineering is way harder than electrical engineering, right? What do we got to memorize 4 equations and we know how to derive everything else? That chemical engineering stuff is way harder. So maybe it's just a perception thing, not is it really hard kind of thing.
Well, I think it's also different people. My husband's a chemical engineer, and I celebrated when I finished my last chemistry class. And, we see...
How many did you have to take?
I had to take 2 quarters of chemistry.
Okay, yeah, we had to take 1 semester at WSU.
Yeah, so I was happy when I got over that. But, I think there's some people that feel... We have a little family rivalry in this, but some people feel electrical engineering is very math heavy. And so there's a lot of equations. In the power area, people say, yeah, I can't really see it, where mechanical engineering, I might be able to see different parts of it. So I think we all have different tendencies and things we like and things that come easier to us. Some people, chemistry comes easy to them, so chemical engineering works. I was not one of those people. But some of the math and electrical engineering I'm much more comfortable with.
I think having to take organic chemistry I would have failed out, and I would have ended up doing something else than being a chemical engineer. Are there other motivators that might attract or detract women from pursuing STEM careers or STEM jobs?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we have with women students in STEM fields is a couple different things. One is what we call imposter syndrome, and that's really where you don't have the self-confidence to think that you're going to make it. You think that you're kind of fooling everyone. You're an imposter in the room, and you've just fooled everybody. And
Have you ever felt that way?
I have.
Really?
I still feel that way. In my 50s, I still feel that way. And that just not this self-confidence. And we see that with our students. And so one of the challenges is they will transfer out even with a high grade point average.
Really?
Because they don't feel they're good enough. And another challenge is internalizing failure, where if they do poorly on a test, they say, I'm not good enough to be here. Well, maybe another student will say, well, the professor wrote a stupid test, was too hot in the room, my calculator stopped working. It's all external, so it's not me. And this is actually something that's important in careers. 32% of women switch out of STEM fields in college, and 30% of women who earned a bachelor's degree in engineering are still working in engineering 20 years later. Only 30%.
Wow.
So 3 out of 10 people get their bachelor's degree in engineering but aren't working in engineering in 20 years.
Now, is that because they moved on to management or other things, or they're just literally out of the
They're not
field?
in the engineering workforce.
Oh, wow.
So, no, because management would be...
Because I'll argue I'm not an engineer anymore, right?
I could argue the president of the university is not an engineer anymore, or a people engineer. You're both people engineers now.
Yeah. So here's the thing. It is... Again, half of the population are women. I'm convinced, we'd have better designs, and if we had a broader pool to get folks to help us solve really hard problems. So, what do you think we can do to encourage women or underrepresented folks to pursue STEM jobs?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I want to anecdote before.
Okay.
The original airbags were designed in cars for the average white male. And so when they were coming out and were used in cars, they found that a lot of women were not getting the same protection as men. And so that is actually when the crash test dummies, they had the whole family. But some of it was that most of the people designing them were males, and so they did the average male height. And they didn't think about short guys, tall guys, or women, or different people. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example where having diversity can be a really important aspect for someone to say, well, what about me if I'm sitting in the car, and some of those kind of things.
That's really interesting.
Yes. So a couple of things that are important. One is, as I mentioned earlier, role models. Role models are really important for someone to say, that's someone that looks like me. And so that's where it's really important for us in middle school, high school, colleges, to have people that have been successful and for them to see you. One of the things with role models I often ask, can you share a failure with the students and how you got over that? Because that's a big challenge with our students today. And I say, resumes are terrible, but because all they do is they show all your successes, and they don't show the failures that you got through or the time something didn't work. And so sometimes students think, well, wow, Dave didn't have any problems. Everything was easy. He just went from A to B to C. And they don't see some of the challenges and how you got through those and the resiliency that it took for that.
That's interesting you bring that up. I was at an employee meeting the other day, and we were talking along a similar lines. And I'll be honest with you, I can rarely remember my successes, but I learn a lot. Well, let me put it there. I remember all my failures because you learn so much from it. That's a really interesting thing to point out to people. It's like, man, I'm not a failure, right? I'm just a success at figuring out how not to do something right. right? That's
Right,
the
but
way it works.
think about a 18-year-old starting in college, and you're giving a seminar, and they see you and your credentials. And what do? We read about all your successes, and they think, wow, if I could only be like him. And if they find out about some of your failures, and so I ask that question all the time with our alumni, and ask engineers and STEM experts to talk about their failures and how they got through that. And that really is interesting to hear how they got fired sometime and found a new opportunity, or, had a barrier and got through that. So I think that's really important for women to see that, because quite often when they run into that first barrier, they think they're not good enough. And the second thing that's really important are networks and support. And research has shown, particularly for women, the formal networks are important, because traditionally men in engineering or STEM have had informal networks that have created that support structure, and women don't have that because they may be the only woman in their group or the only woman in an area. And so having those networks is really important. And I encourage there to be 3 levels of networks: where you're going, a peer network, and where you've been. And I think that's really important for helping along the way, is to have those networks.
How do each of those 3 networks work, or what's behind those?
So where you're going is something we traditionally think about mentors. You find a mentor, and there's someone that is in a path that you're interested in, and you want to talk to them, maybe get insights on the company, things to do and not to do. So it's someone that's ahead of you in your career. The peer mentoring, I think, is one of the places we miss out the most, we don't think about, is we all in our peer group have different talents, and we can learn things from each other that helps us advance in our career. And then I think it's really important, and for me, this has been a focus of my career, is giving back to those coming behind you, making sure, because there were mentors that helped me, that helped pull me up, making sure I'm helping the next generation understand what are the opportunities and how they can make it through and be supportive of that.
Well, that's I think it's really good advice for all. Should probably extend that to other things besides engineering too.
Yeah, I think it could. And the other thing I think is really important with our students today is to think about choices. It's not the same in what I'll say my father's engineering, as he's an electrical engineer, it's about I like the analogy that Sheryl Sandberg uses in the book Lean In, where it's a jungle gym out there in your career. And sometimes we talk about a career ladder, but the challenge with a ladder, you go up or down or you fall off. So with a jungle gym, sometimes you go down to go up. Sometimes you go parallel to get a different set of skills or a different view in a jungle gym. And I think that's really important for today's students, because both men and women, they want to have some balance in their lives of career, personal activities, and sometimes that may mean a change in their job that isn't necessarily a traditional up or down, but gives them a different skill set.
I think that's really good advice, or a really good analogy too, right? Because sometimes you pivot to the right, you don't go up or down because you need to learn a new skill set or something before you can go back up a rung on a ladder. So that's really interesting. So I have a daughter who is studying electrical engineering. She just finished her sophomore year, going to be a junior. She went through DiffyQ, and like most of us, hated it, right? And she was upset because she's an electrical engineer. And then I told her, well, really Laplace transforms is what you're going to use most out of it. So I don't know why we had to do all that other stuff. But that's all. It's all good. She got through all that stuff, did signals and systems. What advice would you give her? I mean, perhaps some of it is find a peer group or networking group, which I think that she's down south, and they have some pretty good stuff. But is there any other advice you give to a young woman studying electrical engineering or about to study electrical engineering?
Well, I think it's important to have a network of people that you can talk to about challenges. I've had students come to me and say, hey, Dr. Schulz, I want to transfer out. I had a senior, in the middle of a senior year, a woman come to me and say, Dr. Schulz, I'm not good enough. I want to transfer out. And I said, hey, why don't you write down kind of the pros and cons, and let's talk about this on Monday. And she came back and said, well, she thought about it. She would be okay. And she has her PhD today in electrical engineering.
Oh, my goodness.
So some of it is having a support group. In addition to the networks that we talked about, having a support group that's someone you can talk to when you have challenges, and not making quick decisions on that. but taking some time, because we all have bad days, and we all have times we don't do well on a test, and we can still get through that. And it's important to have a support structure. And if you don't have that with some of us, I was fortunate to have family support structure, but not everybody has that. So find student organizations. For example, WSU Pullman Society of Women Engineers has something called Schweitzers, and they are juniors, seniors, and graduate students that help mentor freshmen and sophomores. And I think it's sometimes really helpful when you talk to someone else and you find out they had the same problem. You think it's only you, and that can be a challenge. And so it's really important to find some groups of people that you can talk with. And I also think study groups are really important. And those can be sometimes male and female, because in my case, I had to have a male lab partner because there were no other women in my lab. But I think having a group of people you can talk through things, because we all think differently. And if you're studying for a test with 3 different people, maybe one of them explains problem one on the practice test, and because they understand that perspective, and you understand problem number 2. And teaching is an amazing way to learn. Actually, you learn the most by teaching.
I agree 100%.
And so tutoring each other can be a great opportunity for you to learn things. And if you can explain it to somebody else, then you understand it.
All right, last question then. As an employer, what can I do to help encourage women to come into STEM type of vocations? Or once they're here, what can I do to make sure that they don't become, that 70% that decides to do something else later on in their life?
Well, I think having a lot of organizations now have women in STEM type of groups that are getting together and talking about some of the challenges. One of the things I think is important, particularly for women, is to have groups of people in the same life stage. Like if you have someone that just had a baby, to have some other women that have just had a baby to talk about some of their challenges, or someone has aging parents and they're trying to deal with issues around that. And so I think finding those networks and helping provide opportunities for those networks to come together. I also think it's important when you start talking about interviewing processes and things to make sure you have some women involved in that, the same way in your different processes to look at how we're doing things and are we providing the information, like a packet where you're inviting someone and interviewing them. Do you have information on daycare? Do you have information on elementary schools? Do you have things that are family friendly? A lot of these activities now are more family friendly necessarily than just women, but we're finding a lot of men also want to be balancing these activities and activities at work and at home. So, and role models, I think continue to work to have role models and then some safe spaces. And to be honest, there's a lot out there about men are a big part of the solution, is helping provide training and encouraging the men to help be allies for the women in what they're doing, and to understand that some of this, even this imposter syndrome, to think that someone in their 50s has imposter syndrome, then there are people across all these companies that have that. And so if you identify that, the supervisors can help provide a sounding board and talk to those women to make sure, talk through those things to help feel supported in what they do.
Well, Noel, this is a great conversation. I think a lot certainly for me to think about and how we can help, everybody enjoy engineering and help us create great products that improve the world. Thank you again for joining our podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity, Dave.
Thank you for stopping by Schweitzer Drive. Join us again as we learn about, explore, and celebrate electric power. For more information about the show, please visit selinc.com/Schweitzer Drive.